So in this segment, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous sculptors and painters of the High Renaissance period in Italy, and that is Michelangelo, who I'm sure you have heard of. He's famous for his painting of the Sistine Chapel and his sculpture of the David. He grew up in Florence, where he was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio, whom you may remember from the Sassetti Chapel that we looked at in a different segment. He was under Ghirlandaio's apprenticeship, meaning that he was learning how to paint and be an artist from Ghirlandaio, when actually Lorenzo de' Medici asked Ghirlandaio to send him his two best pupils to be trained at the Humanist Academy that the Medici had founded. Why this is really interesting is because it really shows how artists and their status have changed and what patrons wanted from artists had changed. Now, instead of just coming to an artist and saying, I want an image of the Madonna, which had been made a million times before, they wanted artists who were learned, that actually were educated in humanist ideals. And so the Medici actually sought about doing this by taking their best artists in their city, the kind of two most promising pupils, and bringing them within their kind of inner circles of the elite to learn about humanism. And they would learn about everything from kind of studying the ancient arts so that we could get a better idea of naturalism in terms of anatomy and depth of kind of depiction of space, but also in terms of the literature, in terms of philosophy. Michelangelo would have learned about Neoplatonism, for example, at this time. In other words, Michelangelo became one of the elite. He kind of had access to all of the same education, and in doing so could kind of be able to give his patrons exactly what they wanted, this kind of humanist-infused art. But on top of that, and one of the reasons that he becomes one of the most famous and sought-after sculptors of his day is because actually with this kind of change in status, this seeing of an artist as an intellectual, Michelangelo is able to kind of create his own reputation as someone of worth and of note who had his own kind of creative spirit, which, as Vasari says, was actually sent by God. We don't necessarily ascribe to that today, but that was kind of what it was seen to be in his own day. And we're actually looking at two portraits of Michelangelo. We don't really have any kind of painted portraits. There's some disputed images that may or may not have been painted by Michelangelo himself, but here we have two images that we do know were painted during his lifetime by other artists, so we get a kind of idea of what he might have looked like. Now we're going to kind of just jump straight in, and we're going to talk about one of his earliest and most famous pieces, and that is the Pietà. Now the Pietà is a kind of term for the mourning of the Virgin over her dead son, which is what you see here beautifully rendered in marble. So we have the Virgin here holding Christ after he's been crucified and taken down from the cross. This is not a scene that is included in the Bible, but it was a very, very common scene in Northern Europe. So it was actually not a very popular scene before Michelangelo kind of creates it here in stone in Italy, but it was very common in France and Germany and other areas of Northern Europe. And the reason that this scene is sculpted here is actually because of the patron. And the patron of this piece was actually a French cardinal. And what's interesting is actually where Michelangelo made this. This is not in Rome. I mean, this is not in Tuscany, where we said Michelangelo grew up, because one of the important things happens is a political kind of coup happens in the early 1490s in Florence, and a very charismatic preacher named Savonarola rises up and kind of actually manages to kick the Medici and other elite members out of Florence. And this is going to cause a lot of problems for Michelangelo because the Medici were his patrons. They were the ones who invited him to the Humanist Academy, remember? And so he actually has to go and seek his fortune outside of Florence after these events of the early 1400s. And he makes his way eventually to Rome. And that is what we're seeing here. And this was actually at the invitation of an important member of the papal court because of, according to at least Vasari, he managed to trick people into thinking that his sculptures were actually antique sculptures because he was that good. So he gets a kind of reputation as being an excellent sculptor who is as good as anyone from the ancient world. And so he goes to Rome and he gets this commission from a French cardinal for the scene, the Pietà, which is a more northern scene, but is going to have here become a very famous scene in Italy because of what Michelangelo was able to accomplish. And in many ways, I think that because this was not a scene that was very commonly rendered in stone or in paint in Italy in this period, Michelangelo was really able to kind of put his own spin on the image to really create his own identity and really emphasize his own talent in a way that might not have been as easy to do if everyone was creating the same scene. So I think in some ways Michelangelo lucked out that this cardinal wanted this scene. Now the cardinal commissioned this actually for Old St. Peter's. And when I refer to Old St. Peter's, I'm referring to the building that existed where St. Peter's today in the Vatican exists, but an older building that was actually demolished, and we'll talk about that at another moment. But it was made for Old St. Peter's for the tomb that this cardinal hoped to have for himself built there. And so this would have been a very public display in one of the most major churches in Rome, that of St. Peter's. And it would have been seen kind of by everyone who was anyone who came to Rome, and therefore really enabled young Michelangelo, he was very young, in his early 20s at this point, to kind of create this image. And so what are we seeing here? Take a minute to just look at and kind of admire what Michelangelo has been able to accomplish. When you look at this scene, it's one of kind of very quiet sorrow. You get this feeling of sadness, but it's not kind of overdone or kind of overt, but rather just kind of imbued with kind of a quietness from that gentle kind of bending of the head of the Virgin with the kind of just slumpingness of Jesus's body. You get the sorrow, but it's not very gruesome. You barely see the wounds here. You might even think for a second that he's just sleeping. But we have a very balanced and very harmonious and very ideally beautiful scene, which are kind of three traits that are typical of the High Renaissance period. One of the things I want you to think about is how Michelangelo creates a balanced composition here. This is actually a very awkward scene to carve when you think about it. This is a woman with a grown man on her lap, and yet it doesn't seem unstable. It doesn't seem unwieldy. Jesus's body seems to fit quite nicely onto the Virgin's lap in a way that seems completely natural to us, and that is very, very hard to do. And the way that Michelangelo is going to be able to do this is because he's creating a very stable base for this composition. He has created a kind of interlocking group here that creates a triangle. So if you kind of just see that, you can kind of draw a triangle that would encompass these figures. And we often refer to this in art history as a pyramidal composition, pyramids like as in Egypt. And the reason that this is really popular and actually gets popularized in the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, and then used here again by Michelangelo, is because it provides this really kind of balanced and stable composition. Nothing feels like it's going to topple over because you have a very solid base that slowly tapers up into a point, which allows it to have this kind of stability, this sense of kind of balance that is here. Moreover, you see here this kind of ideal beauty. Look at the face of the Virgin here. And this is actually something that contemporaries were very intrigued by. And that is, and some were not actually very happy with, and that is, look at how young and beautiful and delicate her features are. They're extremely realistic. You have a beautiful sense of modeling the way in which the kind of the eyes are kind of descending from the bone above the eyebrow to the way in which the kind of mouth has a slight purse at the side here. All of this kind of creating this just beautiful sense of a real face. And all the features are extremely regular. There's no kind of slightly too large eyes or too large mouth or something like that. They are kind of in the ideal of beauty of this period. And so we have a beautiful face, but we also have an extremely young face. When you look at this, she looks like she could be, I don't know, 15, something, she does not look like she'd be a woman who could have a 33-year-old son. Let's just put it that way. And there were contemporaries at this time that actually criticized Michelangelo for this, saying that she looked too young. But this really goes into that idea of perfecting nature and an idea of who the Virgin herself was. The Virgin was so pure that every kind of goes the traditional way of thinking. She was so pure that, of course, she would have to have her exterior visibly show this purity, this beauty of her interior. And so her exterior beauty is a sign of her interior beauty. And so it is very purposeful here that Michelangelo has made her look like a beautiful young woman. And the reason for that is so that all would know that she is this great and virtuous person. But what's really amazing here in terms of what Michelangelo has done is he really has been able to create a sense of different textures with the marble of this piece. Look at how different flesh and fabric seem. And look here in one of my favorite kind of like passages here, the Virgin's kind of splayed hand beneath the shoulder of her son, and how it kind of pushes up right here on the muscles, that flesh, that give that flesh would have, that marble never would, right? If you pushed on marble, it wouldn't move. Here instead, just like flesh, you get that kind of sense of how the body moves. Now, there is a extremely realistic and great attention to anatomical detail here, something that we also got in the early Renaissance, but something that's going to be continuing to develop here in the High Renaissance, in particular because artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci are actually going to be studying human anatomy from the inside out. They're going to actually ask and get permission from churches to kind of examine bodies at hospitals. I know that Leonardo da Vinci, in fact, was able to dissect bodies that were from criminals. And so they're actually going to have a greater kind of scientific understanding of the body, how, sinew attaches to bone and how muscle works and all of these things, because they are not just studying art, but studying anatomy and all sorts of other things as well to create the most kind of naturalistic, the most perfect kind of rendering of the human form. And I think that ideal beauty can also be seen in Jesus himself. He is nicely muscled, and even though he has been tortured, his body doesn't look deformed. There are slight visible wounds, right? We do have some little bits here, and if you get close to his side, you can see a little bit of blood coming down. But they're not kind of overt and in your face. Instead, he just kind of lays there, beautiful, and almost like he's sleeping. Now, one of the other things that is really interesting here is that Michelangelo has been able to kind of create this stable base of the Virgin's lap in kind of a fictive, not really naturalistic way, but one that almost fools us into not seeing that. And how he's done this is by kind of creating a much larger base for the Virgin's lap by giving her these really voluminous robes, these kind of the garments that are here, hair clothing. It's much kind of fuller than you would expect. And the reason for that is it allows him to kind of splay out her legs in a way that she could actually encompass this grown man's body, when otherwise he would definitely not be able to do so. Now, this piece earned Michelangelo great fame when it was seen. People thought it was amazing and beautiful and rivaling anything from the ancient world. And it's also really interesting because there's kind of a story that rises up around this particular piece, in particular about his signature, which you can just make out here on the kind of sash across the Virgin's chest. As the story goes, and I think this is definitely probably a legend and not necessarily a actual happened event, people were not inclined to believe that Michelangelo, so young, could have created something so incredible. And so, as the story goes, Michelangelo snuck into St. Peter's and carved his name onto the kind of breast of the Virgin here in the same way that an ancient sculptor, one of the famous like Apelles and things like that, and artists of the ancient world would have done, mimicking their kind of signature as a way of claiming and proclaiming his superiority and his kind of fame equal to those greats of the ancient world. Now, I kind of highly doubt that Michelangelo snuck in and put his name here, but I do think that he definitely was intending for his name to stand out and be kind of this claim, this proclamation of a young, kind of brash and very kind of sure of himself individual, of his new stature as one of these great artists like those of antiquity here, that kind of humanist element that's coming in, along with, of course, the ways in which the human body is rendered, etc. So I think that this was intended because otherwise it really just doesn't make sense why the Virgin would have this strap. So it's kind of I think an intentional thing in the story has risen up as just kind of a more interesting way of understanding it. But what is really kind of odd and different about this signature is that this is actually the only piece that Michelangelo will ever sign. So this is his only work that we have his signature on, and it was kind of a proclamation of his coming of age, his like coming onto the scene and being an established artist. And from that point on, he kind of didn't need to sign anything because it was so clearly his. One of the things that we're going to see continuing throughout all of Michelangelo's works is this kind of love for the human body and how the human body and its rendering in paint or in stone, as we see here, can kind of tell the story, tell us about the human soul that inhabits that body. So, for example, the beauty of the Virgin's face, but also here the kind of suffering and kind of sorrow of these figures through kind of their body language. And so he really is very interested and will remain interested throughout his career in how you can use the human body to tell the story, to kind of convey the meaning, to give you this kind of inner understanding of the story in a way that I think is, fairly different than other sculptors. Okay, perhaps Michelangelo's most famous piece, this is his David. We're actually back in Florence at this point. He leaves Rome and he goes back to Florence. At this moment, the government that had been led by Savonarola has kind of has ended and a new kind of government has come into control, and so he's more or less welcomed back into Florence, especially because of his newfound fame. And when he comes back, he's actually commissioned by the Florence Board of Works to create a statue of David. Now, we've already talked about David a lot in this class and how David was seen as kind of a symbol of Florence and its kind of underdog status, and how the Medici had purposefully had this image of David done in bronze by Donatello in their own kind of garden to show themselves as kind of the heroes of the Republic. And that I mentioned when the Medici were kind of expelled at the end of the 1400s and had to leave their kind of palace behind, one of the things that happened was they actually took that statue of David and actually of Judith and Holofernes and brought them in front of the Republic's governmental buildings. Now, what we're going to see here then again is this kind of emphasis on the importance of David and him being a symbol of Florence. Now, what's interesting about this piece, and one of the reasons it's so famous and really does kind of create cement and for all time kind of give Michelangelo his kind of reputation as being so great, is actually because of the marble itself. This is a colossal statue standing just a little under 20 feet tall. It's massive, it's huge, it's a gigantic statue. And that in itself would have been quite a feat. But what really made Michelangelo's David stand out and made people talk about it was, in fact, the fact that this particular marble that he carved from was seen as kind of a rejected piece of marble. It was already kind of started to be carved by a sculptor earlier in the 1400s, so about 40 years earlier, and it was kind of deemed to be too flawed, that the marble was just unworkable and that there would be no way to kind of create this massive statue out of it. And so by taking this piece and kind of being able to create a masterpiece out of it, it's kind of a feat even beyond what you just see in front of you, to take something that was deemed by other sculptors to be uncarvable and be able to carve not just something out of it, but something incredible out of it, really kind of cements Michelangelo's reputation as the great sculptor of the High Renaissance. And so here we see it. And this was commissioned, as I said, for the Florence Board of Works. And it was meant to actually be a sculpture to be placed on top of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. So very high up. That's one of the reasons for its colossal size, is that if it's going to be on top of a dome that's, very high up in the air, maybe 100 feet up in the air, you need a piece that's going to be able to be seen, right? If it's too small, no one will even know it's there. So the colossal size is in part because of its original function, its intention to be placed here on the Cathedral of Florence. And it was commissioned by the church, by people to decorate a church. And I think here's one of those times where humanism and Christianity maybe butt heads more than kind of come into great kind of accord. And Michelangelo, who clearly knew about Donatello's sculpture, he would have been in the garden with it before it was removed, so he definitely knew about it, was inspired by Donatello and by ancient Roman and Greek sculptures to create a nude image of a hero, a biblical hero, remember. And yes, remember, Donatello did already do this, but Donatello created a naked image of David as a hero for a secular garden space, a private, space that was, it was public in the sense that people came there, but it wasn't a church space. And here is where Michelangelo is going to kind of run a little bit afoul, and that is he creates this image. And when the church, the Board of Works, sees it, they freak out. They are like, this is totally inappropriate. We cannot put a nude image of this biblical hero on our church. It's just totally and utterly unacceptable. And this is where I'm saying that humanism and the Christianity don't quite meet up right here. And what's also interesting, of course, is that it tells you how much artistic license Michelangelo had been given. Clearly, the church had said, we want an image of David, but they never bothered to see any of the in-between parts of it where they could have been like, wait, what the hell? Why doesn't he have clothes, right? Clearly, they left everything else up to Michelangelo, showing this new kind of increase in the status of artists, because we have a moment when Michelangelo is actually able to kind of create something somewhat independent of what his patrons actually desire. And this could have been a colossal flop, right? The church actually refuses it. They do not want it. It is not going to be placed on the church because it is deemed kind of unacceptable for a church space. But because humanism has such a kind of foothold in Florence, and this image with its clear references to the classical world and its just incredible artistry in terms of how it rendered the human body. I mean, if you just look at this gorgeous contrapposto, the attention to detail in terms of how muscle would move and how you can see kind of the bone underneath the muscles and the sinew, how you would actually have kind of one part leading to the other in the human body. It's all so perfectly kind of realized that the elite Florence were not okay with the idea of this being destroyed. There was no way they were going to let this magnificent sculpture not exist anymore. And so even when it gets kind of rejected by the church itself, Florence itself kind of rallies behind it, and there's actually a committee that's held, and they bicker back and forth and kind of determine where this is going to actually be placed if it's not going to be placed on the cathedral. And the decision is that it should join the other David we've talked about, that of Donatello's, in front of the Piazza di Signora, which is the Republican Florence headquarters, so their kind of governmental buildings. And so this image then joins those other images as a kind of symbol of Florence, a symbol of the kind of willingness of the underdog Florence to fight the good fight. But do remember that we have a very different moment seen here. Michelangelo has changed the story up on us. And again, I think this is one of the ways in which he is showing off his own artistic personality. He could have easily done a similar image to that of Donatello and included, Goliath's head and a victorious David. But Michelangelo here kind of, with his own artistic license, determines that instead a different moment is going to be shown. And so the moment he shows here is not the aftermath of the battle with the victorious hero, but rather the prelude, the waiting before the battle, the moment before he has triumphed. And so we see David here with his sling and his rock, looking off into the distance as though he sees the image of Goliath coming towards him. And he is waiting, ever vigilant, for this foe to arrive and for him to take him out. And so here, rather than the kind of image of a puny boy who defeated a tyrant with the hand of God, we get this kind of symbol of the noble, heroic underdog Florence, which doesn't really look much like an underdog anymore, but rather like the perfect hero, and that they're ever vigilant and ever ready to fight the good fight, to keep and protect Florence, that Florence is always ready to face its next battle. And so we have kind of a very different message here, a different meaning, but, one that is kind of meant to speak to the concerns of Florence, the idea that they will fight. But there's kind of an optimism here that is really quite amazing. This idea of David here as perfection rather than as a weak boy. Here, instead of kind of gentle curves, we have the strength that is reminiscent of ancient Greek statuary. And we have our own kind of Renaissance hero reborn in the classical guise. And so this huge statue would have stood before the buildings of the government of Florence as a kind of symbol of Florence and as a warning to anyone who might think to kind of go against them. And so Michelangelo really kind of creates an image that is beloved by Florence. The other thing that's really interesting, and just kind of like one of these little side points, is that if you see this in person, and I think even here in the picture, certain things seem maybe a little wrong to us and might kind of detract from the beauty of this piece. And one of those is the kind of oversized hands. David really seems like he has really, really large hands. And I think that for us this kind of is distracting, but one of the reasons that Michelangelo did this, and it's not because he didn't understand human anatomy, he absolutely did, was because he was taking into account the fact that David would be seen from below, from far below, if this was supposed to be put on top of the church. And so he made the hands larger so that you could still read them, so that you could still understand them and see that they held these kind of weapons in them that would have been there. So we have this image where that kind of importance of, almost perfecting nature, to be able to kind of be seen from far away. So we have this image that is ideally beautiful. It's in the classical Greek and Roman manner, and it is ideal. This is not a living person, but someone who kind of surpasses the living person to stand in for Florence and for the humanist ideals of the day.